Hi, my name is Hyuntae Choi.
Hi, my name is Marco Jimenez, and we are the hosts of Full Cadence podcast.
Full Cadence believes in the power of the arts to sustain the human spirit. Through sharing stories of young artists in the performing, visual, and literary arts who are making a difference in their communities, we hope to inspire our listeners to examine how they can use their own talents and unique skill sets to do good.
We also aim to forge a network of artists dedicated to their craft and to advancing issues of social justice. Coupled with special episodes exploring the vast world of classical music, Full Cadence ultimately seeks to excite hope and joy in our audience.
If you would like to be featured on this podcast or would like to nominate someone, please feel free to contact us at fullcadencepodcast@gmail.com and follow us on our Facebook page and Instagram, links in the description. Our special guest for this episode is Anya Singh. Anya Singh is a freshman attending University of Michigan, Ann Arbor with an intended focus on biology, health, and society, and a double minor in art and design and in social class and inequality studies. She's been a practicing visual artist for the past 11 years, most recently under the tutelage of Kirti Taneja. Anya's work, influenced by social, political, and cultural issues, is heavily commentative and reactionary. Believing in the importance of imbuing her work with her political views and biases, her work comes together to provide insight into her perspective. As an artist concerned with social justice, Anya has delved into movements like #MeToo, Black Lives Matter, Time's Up, and more, and specifically has explored cultural and judicial practices across domestic borders, such as in India, regarding child marriage, LGBTQIA+ rights, and female autonomy. As she creates, she seeks to understand narratives, bringing stories to life on paper, canvas, and other media. Specifically in portraiture, she focuses on creating confluences of narrative and representational reality while empowering the underrepresented. As an artist, she has been invited to prestigious programs such as the Instagram Counter Speech Fellowship and has been recognized by Scholastic for her work in painting, drawing, mixed media, and political cartoons. In 2019, she won the New York Times editorial cartoon contest and was subsequently published. You can contact her after the show at anyas@umich.edu, and you can follow her on Instagram at Anya_Singh_art. Anya, welcome to Full Cadence.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How about you?
Doing well.
So Anya, I know how a lot of your own work is very influenced by current events and also by politics and by your own personal views and biases. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this and also about how your experience as an artist has helped you in fighting for justice.
I think I started using art as a medium of political expression because I, as a daughter of immigrants, as a person of color, it's not always encouraged for me at home to speak through words or through writing because it's a very in-your-face dissent, and dissent is sometimes used as dangerous. And I think that there's something really wonderful about the subtlety, but the confidence in opinion and art. You're not shoving words, a concrete perception in someone's face, but if it shows up as an image, it's harder to identify what discomforts you about it. While it's very easy to take a passage, a sentence in an essay and be like, this is wrong. It's harder to point at a place in art and say, this is wrong, and this is what makes me uncomfortable. So I think art is nicely disarming in the way that it sneaks up on you and it forces you to a perception you're not gonna always readily embrace with words. And I think but for a lot of my inspiration in my work, I go to words for my inspiration. I go to news sources, and I heavily appreciate the bias in news. I think it's really wonderful how news is supposedly unbiased, how it's supposed to be facts, but I love the opinion section because it just, you can just feel the bias of the author and how they try so hard to not to seem biased. But I like to weigh how much I believe in that bias, and if the author has a point, if I agree with it. I think I do make art that I agree with opinions, political opinions that I agree with. But one of my favorite political cartoonists, Michael Ramirez, is a person I ideologically differ with and would go as far as say I fundamentally despise his opinions. But Michael Ramirez, if you don't know, is a conservative political cartoonist. He's very world acclaimed. He is a wonderful artist, and he makes conservative points. What I love about him is that when I look at the cartoon, even though I will not appreciate his opinion, no matter how illogical, strikes me as this could be possible. Just I think it's very important, and the idea of power of art, and he's the epitome of it. So that's sort of, I think, that process of understanding the power of art, and then understanding that this could be a platform where I can say my opinions and not have it maybe be met with a wider audience than words or speech can do.
Is it possible to disconnect the art from the artist, do you think?
I think it depends on which artist you ask that. And in my opinion, it's not. I think every time you put a paintbrush or a pen or something to paper and you draw something out, I think art has intention. And I think it's doing a disservice to an artist to say that when a person depicted something like this, they had no intention behind that. And I think I've heard arguments of it other way too. And I just personally think maybe it's because I put so much intention in my work, and how I think the depths of my work is so dependent on my intention that to dissociate it would be leaving a work, just my work bland, and my work would have no point.
Question, do you consider art that uses a lot of randomized elements or elements of chance to be arts with intention?
I do. And I think intention is a funny word in that you might think of intention as like a point, but one of the artists I think most people find fascinating is Jackson Pollock. Like, his work is what a bunch of paint scribble, like that's, if someone looks at it, if that's what I think I started off with too, like the point of just like he splattered a bunch of paint onto a canvas and called it art and sold it for an insane amount of money. Where is the intention in that? You can't, I don't think it's easy to look at his painting and pinpoint the point where that's intentional. His work is dependent on randomization, and that's, I think, what the perception is. My art teacher, Stacy, in school, I think brought an like a perspective that I hadn't really thought about, was that there are trends within Pollock's work. And how can you have trends if you don't have an intention? How can mathematicians create equations for a trend in art if it was so randomized? So I won't go as far ever to say I understand the intention behind Pollock's work, because I could never go on to that tangent. But I think intention we might have to loosen our definition of intention in order to apply it to all artists.
That's really fascinating, because I think that in other art forms, I mean, being a musician, I know that in music, it often happens that music that incorporates a lot of randomized elements, there are correlations between different randomized works. And so it's a really interesting point. So, I mean, in modern times, I mean, what do you view as the role of art in the 21st century or in today's times?
Oh, the role, I feel, okay. The role of art, I think art as a very malleable tool. I think the beauty of art is its application in different ways. I think art can be used as a tool for change. I think art can be used as a tool of comfort. and it can also be used as perhaps anti-progression. I think the role of art has to always be defined by the artist. And I think that's where I would differ from other artists, because I view art as a tool or an expression of an artist. Whereas the role of art, I feel like, is perhaps very similar to the role of writing in society. I think it demonstrates the humanity, it demonstrates the opinions, the artists themselves. So I think I have a particular view of art as a tool, which a lot of artists would disagree with. They would give art its own life, separate it from the artist, and I fundamentally cannot. So I think the role of art is to represent the humanity of the time.
I see. So to you, every artwork is inextricably linked with the artist or the time period, right?
I think so, and I think that you can find you can find evidence to back that and to refute it. But I think most evidence to refute it would be demonstrating artists who are going back, whose work references a previous time period, or whose work fundamentally is different than the opinion of that time. But I personally view that as indicative of how artists counterculture, I believe, is a trend that's still relevant to modern times.
Is art what is intended by the artist or what is seen by the audience? Because when you talk about the all art being connected to the history of when it was, or the historical context, that also changes through different perspectives and different eyes. So I was wondering what you thought about how art is different once you release it to the general public.
That's the age-old question, isn't it? I think that's not a perception you limited to art. I think that applies to writing and poetry, and asking, like, what was the author's intention? How does the audience apply their own bias in its interpretation? And to be honest, I'm not sure if I have a good enough answer for this, but I think, yeah, my perception is that is heavily based on artists who are still alive, on artists that can answer for their work, and artists who have memoirs and writings and opinions that we can sort of try to decipher and assume that that was intention. But as always, whenever we're interpreting something, we cannot dissociate ourselves from our own bias. And I would still argue that the importance of art in my art, I think my art is commentary on modern problems, on problems that are affecting now. But a lot of these problems are not limited to this time. Conflict, and I think human nature, makes it so that these problems are long and enduring. If a famous artist right now creates something in a modern context and an audience 50 years later chooses to interpret that art in that context, I think it's their right, and I think it's their bias. And I think it serves the author's purpose of that commentary, that if it still applies or if it's applicable in a different bias, it's no less valid.
Do you ever think it can be harmful for art to be pulled out of the original context it was created? Or do you think it's a role of art to always be interpreted in that context of the audience?
I think there are a lot of instances where art can be out of context harmful. And I think there's no way to prevent taking art out of context. And I think like I'm gonna use perhaps example, art coming from the time period of fascism and out of Nazi Germany, and arguing whether it's really ethical to dissociate a Nazi artist from their art. A lot of art that we use right now, from logos to perhaps actual artwork, has been heavily dissociated from their original work, including, I think, a lot of logos now, a lot of art, like especially like stuff that's connected with cultural appropriation, with racism. When you see it for a long time, you don't remember the context it was coming from. And I think with right now, with like Black Lives Matter and a lot of art and logos that were associated with racism, where companies are trying to change their work by acknowledging that this was from a period of racism. There's this, I don't think most people look at those logos anymore and realize the context. And you can say that that's the ethical responsibility of the company to acknowledge that what they did was what that logo stems from. But there's not, only society can police it. So I think at the end of the day, context and context policing is an ethical problem that people will have to deal with themselves.
That's fascinating. And in that vein, I might ask you, so I know you talk about how Michael Ramirez is a conservative artist, but that in the same vein, you still find yourself able to appreciate his art. And I would ask you, what do you think is the role of freedom of expression in art, in the sense that do you think that there should be topics that ought to be off limits for certain artists?
I think artists should, I do believe in freedom of speech, but I will say that I cannot appreciate freedom of speech when its context is used to harm others.
Mm-hmm.
That freedom of speech, I do believe that there are limitations if your right to freedom of speech harms a specific group, if it generates hate, if it generates harm, then I think you have a moral responsibility to understand what the implications of your art are. I think you can't separate the implications of your art and the consequences of what you churn out because you don't live in a bubble. I think freedom of speech can't be taken in as a bubble that this is my art, this is my opinion, and because it's my opinion, it cannot harm anyone else, and I have a right to say it. And as for who can produce what kinds of art, I think that's a complex question, and I think that has been sort of struggled with, including I think there was a white artist, her name escapes me right now, but she had a huge project displaying the brutality of African-American life throughout history. And when I say brutality, I mean graphic depictions of brutality. And as a white artist, there was a lot of questions whether she has the right to commercialize, perhaps, to sell Black pain. And in my opinion, I don't think she does have a right, but I think if someone was a stringent believer in freedom of speech, I think they would say that they do have the right. So I think at the end of the day, my opinion of freedom of speech remains that you can't, as long as your right to freedom of speech does not harm, does not generate terror, does not generate pain, then go for it. But depends on if I was a conservative, perhaps. If I wasn't such a self-acclaimed liberal, I think I might have a different answer.
Do you think that there's advantages for art being deliberately provocative?
When we say provocative, I think a lot of artists, when the first thing we think of is the most extreme sort of art, when artists themselves are the art and they invite people to, like, I think there's always been a circulation of the rule, like in the news, of the artists who like said like, I will stand naked in Times Square or something.
Mm.
And this is my this is how I'm going to provoke you into thinking. I think on one hand, yeah, it gets immediate news coverage, it gets people's immediate reaction. But the idea of that sensationalization, you can provoke people, yes. And I think it's a very nice tool to provoke people because you get attention really fast. But what kind of reaction are you provoking from them? And I think that makes a difference, in my opinion, of art that's a social commentary, that's digging into social justice work, is what sort of reaction is that provocation causing? Is it causing a dismissal? Is it causing disgust? Or is it actually genuinely causing someone to feel discomfort and re-challenge the way that they think? when I say that I want to try to do social justice in my art, I think my main path is to try to make someone uncomfortable enough with what they believe that they might try to seek out changing it themselves, because I think it's a very hard thing to point blank tell someone that you're wrong and that your opinion is wrong. I think the immediate reaction to that is obviously going to be defensive. So, but if someone takes that self-growth themselves, the path themselves, I think there's opportunity there. And I think that's, in my opinion, one of the stronger places where you can actually change what people believe in.
What are some of your favorite projects that you conducted?
As in pieces I've actually made, I think there are two pieces that I personally was very attached to. And I think one series was dealing with the disenfranchised in India. And I think, I don't know how much you guys are familiar with the caste system in India, but the lowest class, the Dalits, there's immense casteism, there's immense prejudice, and depictions of Dalit are darker. There's always that aspect of colorism in there, as darker people, poorer, and that conception of being dirty, of quote unquote dirtiness. And I think, and I personally found it very interesting when I tried to research into it, the pictures news media used in talking about Dalit problems and Dalit related articles, sorry. And it was people in extreme poverty, people who were, to put it nicely, were wearing rags, who were people who were homeless. And the Dalit population is humongous, and there's a lot of empowerment there. There's a lot of, the main person who wrote the Indian Constitution was a Dalit. Ambedkar, he was a Dalit, he was an extremely educated man. And I think I always find it very fascinating how media chooses to portray certain groups. So in my project, I really like the idea of erasing context. So I had created these black and white images of Dalit women, and I took images of Rajput women, the highest, the kingly class. And in black and white, I depicted them both with jewelry. And the idea that you cannot tell who is who. You cannot tell which person is the lower caste, who is dirty, and who is supposedly pure. And then I also used, I like the idea of representing purity with the Byzantine art, the halos of gold. So I incorporated that, and the idea of, with no context, purity can be assigned to anyone. And then another project that I really liked was dealing with how women in Indian society can be oppressed. One of those, I started off with child marriage because I have seen, I think it would disgust most people. But I had been involved with a different nonprofit, and I think I interacted with these young women who had been married from the age of as young as 14. And so I wanted the chance somehow to pick that. So I started off, I drew this girl, basically. I think she was 12 years old. It's a real person. And next to her was her husband, a person who was 50 years her senior. And I think I started off with, I drew her face, and there was this huge height disparity, obviously. I think her face ended here, and then his was about there. And I got this idea of erasing his context too. So you can only see the chin of that man, and then the whole, basically almost half of the profile of the girl. And this idea of giving importance to the girl in that image, so coloring her, whereas keeping the man black and white. And once I got started with that sort of spiraled into a bigger series where I sort of explored how gay men are viewed in society, how they're not accepted, and then rape culture and the idea of women not having power. So that whole series became this idea of giving power to and focusing on that individual that I'm choosing to depict, that India society in general has not given importance to. I think what interestingly changed art, my perception of art, was political cartooning. This very intentional medium that forces someone to think a different way than they originally do. I think that first sort of made me realize how much perspective matters in art. I don't think I'd seen it. I think most kids grow up with the idea of art being a representational thing, very simple. And I think I believe, like, I'm pretty sure I probably until high school I was still very much in that mindset of drawing something pretty, of getting techniques right, of getting like the technical aspects of art without substance. And I think perspective has that idea of perspective completely revolutionized the way I think inside of my mind of art. That I think perspective gave art power in my world. And then this exploration of perspective of my subjects, of the ideas I'm looking at, I think that's what allowed me to change my own perspective. I think as I researched, I think my perspectives changed from black and white to grayer areas. And as I think most research does to most people. And that idea of representing that grayness as black and white again in art sort of, I think, changed the way I think of things.
I think I find really interesting is how you talk about the literal representations, I guess what we see as not necessarily being the function of art, even the most important thing. So I know that you talk about how in your own artwork you often, I guess, distort like the literal meaning of reality for a certain effect. So I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit more about this.
I think my focus on trying to distort what you initially perceive is sort of my push against that snap judgment of society. And I think if that representational reality, when you look at something, you have preconceived notions. And in order to fight that, you have to make something different. You have to give someone a pause and give them a second to overcome that notion that I biased beforehand. And I think the idea of erasing context for me came from Barclay L. Henderson, amazing artist. He works largely in portraiture. He's an African, his subjects are largely African American, and he depicts them as, his technique is beautiful, but they have no context. They are people with poses, with actions, or perhaps straight, but there's nothing in the background besides maybe a color. And I sort of I found it very interesting because even in most portraiture, you're still gonna have something. Like you might be in a study, you might, there might be some nice clues in the study, like there's a globe there, this person's worldly. Like I think portraiture has always been about having the background define the person, giving clues of what they are, what they believe in. And here comes, and I think other artists have used this too, but he was my first exposure to an artist that had no context. That was like, this is a person, you make your assumptions and let's see how you do. And I think, and he uses different types of subjects, different things that they're wearing, that so you still have that concept of building some person's identity, but you don't have any clues. So using him, I think I started this idea of erasing context as my way of distorting your initial assumption when you look at something.
That's fascinating. I know that, I mean, in literature, there's a trend going back for at least 100 years in the Western traditions of, a kind of less emphasis on plot per se and more emphasis on character. So I was just thinking right now, maybe this is somewhat echoed in less emphasis on background / context and more emphasis on the literal representations of the figures.
I was wondering what you thought the connections within the arts are. So you talked a bit about your experience creating the virtual AP Art Studio gallery, and you talked about the architectural element to it as well as the visual art. So I was wondering, what are some connections you see that bind the arts together, that complement, where the disciplines complement each other?
I think art is this huge umbrella, and I think most people, it's sort of hard to define where art ends and what defines art. When I started looking into art more in depth, probably high school, I didn't like the idea that art is not defined, that someone could tape a literal banana to the wall and call it art. I'm like, what sort of community is this? I think there's always that string of insanity that runs in art. So the different places where art takes you, I think, is probably what I think connects artists is this idea of opinion. In my opinion, like, say it again, in my opinion, what connects artists is that they're imbuing, they have intent. If there's an intent in something that you're creating, I think you can call it art. And I think in that sort of sense, that umbrella definition can be applied to something beyond the visual arts too. You can apply that to writing. Even though I know you guys do have a lot of exposure to it, I have basically no exposure to music as art. So I wouldn't presume to comment on it. But in poetry and writing, I think intent and that sort of gives it credence as art. When you're building something, and you can build some things in different ways. You can build it with pen, you can build it with clay, you can build it with words or music notes or sound. So I think art because it has such a loose definition, it allows people to go every which way with it. And I think a lot would argue that that's the beauty in the art.
And it's all about, building narratives and building stories and building perspectives that might not be usually talked about or heard. What are some of your sources of inspiration?
I think sources of inspiration, I think, depends on if I'm trying to look for material, I really do like the propaganda of news. I did mention it. I absolutely adore it, I think. And recently I've sort of started looking at media in television too, not only written media, and I find it absolutely hilarious. I have obviously a very liberal bias, but CNN always cracks me up because the amount of propaganda, it doesn't matter that I agree with it, but it's so interesting to hear the bias in it. And so I always turn to, I think, news for the bias for things I want to comment on. And then I always juxtapose it with the same sort of stories that are coming from a more right, a more conservative source. I think that's where I usually get the inspiration for my personal pieces. But I think artistically, I do end up turning to established artists, to artists who have who have used techniques to bring certain things to light, like Barkley Henderson and like groups like Gorilla Girls, who Gorilla Girls themselves are very sensational in the way that they were very aggressive in what kind of position that they want to put forward, and the fact that they're anonymous is always a freeing thing in art. Like Banksy is one of the most famous anonymous artists of our time currently, and his work is completely commentary. He installed a shredder in the frame, so once it's sold for a couple million, or is it, I think it might be higher than $1 million, he shredded it. He shredded the painting. And so there's this, I think I do in the end do turn to these artists who are commenting in current times for artistic inspiration. And I think my personal inspiration still comes from my news sources. I think that also is very dependent on the type of art that I choose to do. I think I very much do try to keep my art very focused on social justice and using that as my outlet. And so because of that, I think news sources work as a really nice inspiration for me. But I think when I do casual art, I think I sort of run wild. As an artist myself, I can't really lean into the whole modern art and abstract. Like I can appreciate abstract art, but I don't think I could. I think my inspiration, since it comes from such concrete places and I wish to have such a concrete message, that it sort of shapes itself what sort of art I will create from it.
I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about, I guess, the relationship between I guess, good propaganda and good art? Because I mean, we have a tradition going back for hundreds of years of art actually using propaganda or being an instrument of propaganda. I mean, in music, we have music that's being written to promote nationalism. We have obviously the classic example of Soviet composers writing for the glory of the Soviet Union. And so, can you talk a little bit about that, maybe?
I think art as a propaganda is a very interesting thing, and I think I've also like tried to spend time to try to analyze it. Back in post, I think World War I was this Dada movement, this idea of randomization of um, political commentary as drawn by disillusioned um, war veterans. And I was looking at this randomization, and the first thing when I thought of war was the propaganda of Rosie the Riveter. And I understand that's a huge jump from World War I to II, but I find Rosie the Riveter one of the most fascinating pieces of propaganda, because it's when you think of Rosie the Riveter now, you're gonna think feminism. I think it's become an icon of feminism, and it wasn't created with that intention. It was created, war propaganda very specifically changed throughout the war. When they first needed people when they needed people in factories, they started off with propaganda that says this is your duty. Now you're a person who is coming out of the home into the factories, and this is how you're patriotic. And as soon as the men came back from war, it was your duty to the nation is now going back to your homes and giving up those jobs to these war veterans who are coming back with no jobs. And your duty is now to go back into the home and be happy, smile, and put your clothes in the clothespin and go back. So I think propaganda at that time was inherently very anti-feminism, but Rosie the Riveter now has been appropriated as this huge feminist icon. Like, I think, especially with the new concept of stickers on laptops, like, I think if a person is saying that they're a feminist, they have that Rosie the Riveter sticker on their laptop. So I think there is some sort of, I think any art that's propaganda, usually you think governmental, you think army, you think people, a large institution that wants to change the way you think. But if you look at my art, then anyone can argue that that's propaganda towards a liberal standpoint. Any art that has opinion, which I think basically every art, I don't think that goes back to the argument that you can't dissociate opinion and art, is propaganda. And then I think so in that sense, I guess there's always going to be appropriation of propaganda. And in my opinion, I don't mind that the Rosie Riveter has gone from its anti-feminist roots to now the icon of feminism. Like, they've appropriated, and it's been appropriated nicely. Like, but so propaganda, I think in the end, it's how you use it and what your intention is when you're using it.
I mean, and the example you give, it's interesting to see how, I mean, it was created with the anti-feminist message, but then it's now become a feminist icon. So one thing I might ask is, because the creation and the interpretation are so diametrically opposed, does that mean that both interpretations exist in the art itself, or is art nothing more but art perception?
I think, I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly, but I think, again, that's that question of interpretation and taking it out of context.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of can you take Rosie the Riveter out of context and use it in a different context? And I think a lot of it does have the idea of erasing context. I don't think most people do remember what context Rosie the Riveter came into. Rather, they imply their own modern take that this was that time when women were finally allowed to come out of the house, and that's why she's a feminist icon. I think there's you purposely blind yourself to the other types of propaganda that were coming out in that age and blinding yourself to context. So it's that idea of whether when you're interpreting something in a modern time, if you can erase the context of the past. And I still don't know if I have an answer to the ethics of erasing context, because in the end of the day, I did say I don't mind that Rosie the Riveter was appropriate in a modern context, because in my opinion, it's a better context than the past. But perhaps that's not that doesn't give the artist, the government, enough credit. So in the end of the day, I think it matters who you're asking about, whether it's appropriate to appropriate something. You're asking right now a liberal artist who is a feminist herself. So yeah, I'll say that, oh yeah, it was perfectly fine to appropriate this propaganda and use it for a better, quote unquote, better purpose. So erasing context perhaps has a lot to do with convenience of who's you're asking. It's convenient for me to allow that erasure of context because it doesn't then suit me.
In what ways is the way you approach biology different or similar to the way you approach art?
I think there's this requirement of meticulousness. I think of this attention to detail, and I think in this very specific sphere of where I want to go, I think I am thinking about being a surgeon, and more specifically a neurosurgeon. I think there is a lot of precision in surgery that is pretty convenient for an artist, considering you have to train yourself for so many years to not have your hand shake as you draw the finest line you can. So I think very logistically and practically, there's that connection of precision. And more abstractly, I think my art at least has taught me empathy. I think that idea of forcing yourself to step in someone else's shoe, whether it be the subject of who you're drawing, or perhaps as you view another artist picture, or if you view their artwork, sculpture, that idea of generating empathy as both as your responsibility and having empathy as your responsibility as an artist. So, and then I think that very clearly translates to how you want your doc to be empathetic with you. I would assume my art, in the way it's grown, forced me to grow, is what's really gonna impact the way I think of as a doctor. And so in that sort of sense, and then I think there's a lot to be said about how the brain works when we're writing and when we're creating, and how it's a completely different sphere of ourselves, and how that idea of thought is really manifested physically in the brain. That's another point of fascination for me.
What advice might you give to some young emerging artists or just art lovers who might be listening to this?
I think I would go back to something I've probably mentioned a lot of times: opinion. I think not getting scared by saying your opinion, because opinion is always something so personal. So something that you might think is wrong, I think it's so personal to you that it's sort of hard to put your opinion in something. And I think putting your opinion in something requires confidence. And unfortunately, as we're teenagers, as we're kids, confidence is not something everyone has in spades. I know I certainly didn't a couple years ago. I'm not sure if I do right now even. But that having that confidence in yourself to voice your opinions, and not even if it's perhaps not in art, perhaps in your speech, perhaps in your writing, but being comfortable with your opinion, and in turn being wise enough perhaps to recognize that your opinion might need to change. So that dealing with that balance, I think that's what is something fundamentally important to being an artist, but also as a human in current society.
Anya, thank you for talking about the power of empathy and the power of framing your own perspectives with conviction and confidence. I think that's a really important message for people to hear. And thank you for coming on the show. It's been a great pleasure to have you with us. You can contact Anya at anyas@umich.edu. And you can follow her on her art Instagram, Anya_Singh_art. And signing off, this is Full Cadence. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and feel free to contact us via fullcadencepodcast@gmail.com.